Hello, and welcome to the BUS 125 lecture on commas, Part 2. Here we'll continue discussing our rules of comma usage. We'll also talk about a few places where you don't want to use commas and some comma pitfalls. Let's get started. Okay, let's talk about the next rule in our series, rule number 4, and I call this the non-essential rule. Now you've seen this before, perhaps in your own writing, and you might have seen it in some of the previous rules. But the basic thing is we want to use commas to set off what we call non-essential information, and that is if the sentence could read the same without that stuff that you're setting off with commas, and that stuff is non-essential. And usually I refer to this also as parenthetical information, or it's the kind of information that you can picture when you're speaking. You would pause, or you would almost whisper because it's not important to the meaning of the sentence. And here are a few examples. She will, however, lecture until 1:50. You could simply say she will lecture until 1:50, but we've decided to pause and add a little non-essential information. She will, however, lecture until 1:50. And you can now almost see the speaker do that, sort of indicating through speaking that there would be a comma there. She will, in the interest of time, spend only a few minutes on this slide. A better alternative, Russell and I think, is to do more exercises. The students, learning to love commas by now, wanted to learn more. So keep in mind, when you have these independent clauses containing these interrupting, what we call parenthetical or explanatory elements, they are set off with commas on either side because it's not important or it's not essential. It's adding some color to the sentence, but it's not critical, and therefore you can use commas. Why don't you give self-assessment D a try and see if you can recognize some of this information and learn to set it off with commas. You can pause this recording. Let's talk about rule number 5, the appositive rule. And to me, appositives are a little bit like that non-essential information, but there's a bit more explanation involved. And really all an appositive is, and I have them in red here, it's a word or words that are going to provide you some extra information about the preceding word. So in this case, we've got the new student, John Smith, came to class. Well, John Smith is giving you more information about student, and therefore it's relatively non-essential, although it's providing some color and some information. So what we want to do is set it off with commas. The new instructor, a former naval officer, gives interesting lectures. The same thing. This is in a positive. This former naval officer is describing the new instructor. It's really non-essential, and it's the kind of thing that we would almost picture pausing when we're talking, so we set it off with commas. But I want you to take a look at these below. My son John is attending Palomar College, and the year 2010 is approaching quickly. Well, I think the second example provides a better example of my point, which is, in this case, it's not quite in a positive. You might even assume in this first bullet that you have several sons, but you're saying my son John is attending Palomar College. You can almost hear when you're speaking that you don't really pause. You don't say my son John is attending Palomar College. Now, if you were addressing John, you would say, hey, you, John, stop doing that. And that's a different kind of use for commas. That would be direct address that we'll talk about later. But in this case, you're talking to someone, you're wanting to say your son John, there's no pause, you don't need to set it off. And the second one, really obvious. You wouldn't just say the year is approaching quickly. 2010 is kind of needed in that. And actually, we should update this to the year 2012 is approaching quickly. Either way, you don't need to set that off with commas. You use it with appositives and related constructions, but in these down here, make sure that you don't set it off with commas if it's important or necessary to the meaning of the sentence. Let's move on. Continuing, now rule number 5, I want to talk a little bit about these titles, abbreviations, dates, state names, all thrown in here together. Titles are interesting, like MD, PhD, DDS, or junior, senior, whatever. You can use commas, or you don't need to use commas. It's up to you. The rule is, if you do, use them in pairs, before and after. Like Eric Smith Jr., before and after. So pick what you want, but stick with one, and either with commas or without commas, but don't ever use just one comma. Like John Sullivan, PhD is the speaker. You want to use it before and after. Crazy rule, but that's the way it is. Let's talk about dates. We have two differences here. In month, day, year format, you actually set off the year. So again, just like the titles, before and after. But in month, year, no commas at all. So just keep that in mind. July 1st, 2003, is the date of the completion, versus July 2003 is the date of completion. And then you know this. We use a comma to separate a city name from a state, but again, the state is set off with commas. Idaho Falls, comma, Idaho, comma, is my favorite city. Why don't you give self-assessment E a try and see if you can put some of this into practice. Let's talk about which and that, one of my favorites. Which and that are some words that can appear in the sentence that usually come right after something that you want to explain. And the rule is whether you use which or that has to do again with whether what you're explaining is necessary to the meaning of the sentence or just extra information. If it's necessary to the meaning of the sentence, you're going to use the word that and no commas. That does not take a comma, but which always takes a comma. And when you're using which in a comma, like you might think about, commas, usually indicating non-essential information. So if I'm using which, whatever I have in there better be non-essential information. I'm going to use it with a comma. And let's take a look. In this first sentence, let's say we're talking about inventory that is damaged being discounted. Well, look at how important that is to the meaning of the sentence. Only inventory that is damaged will be discounted. That's important because that's different from only inventory will be discounted. What? We mean only inventory that is damaged. Important to the meaning of the sentence, we do not need commas. But down here, we've chosen to use which because we said, the damaged inventory, which was ruined in the earthquake, will be sold at a discount. I'm not sure I really need to know this part, really, the which was ruined in the earthquake. It's nice extra information. But all I really need to know is that the damaged inventory is going to be sold at a discount. So in that case, I use which with a comma. Let's move on. Let's talk about some comma pitfalls. 3 things. You don't want to use a comma between a subject and its predicate, like all invoices from vendors, there's our subject, must be signed, there's our predicate. You don't need a comma there. To complete your assignments is your subject, remember that from our earlier lecture, requires an early start. Only when this infinitive phrase to complete your assignments is some kind of introductory element will we use the comma, but in this case it's acting as the subject, so we don't need the comma, so you would get rid of it. You don't want to use a comma between a verb and its object. Carol has been, there's our subject and our verb. Carol has been what? That's our object, a great employee. That's incorrect. We do not want to use that comma there. We should get rid of that. And then this third one, do not use a comma to separate a noun from its preposition. A noun from its preposition. So the sales representatives from ABC Company will be here shortly. We do not need to separate that from ABC Company from sales representatives, and so you would get rid of that comma right here. And that's also essential information too, so again, no need to separate it. Why don't you give self-assessment F a try and see if you can put some of these things into practice. Rule number 6, we call this the consecutive adjectives rule, and let's take a look. Let's talk about Lauren. Lauren is a smart, interesting, attractive person. That's words in a series, and in this case consecutive adjectives, and we would separate those with commas. I want you to think about how the comma is sort of taking the place of the word and. Laura is a smart and interesting and attractive person. And we've chosen, I don't want the conjunction. I'm just going to use my commas. Lauren is a smart, interesting, attractive person. Same thing with number 2. Tim voiced his opinion. You could say in a forceful and logical manner. But we've chosen to use our comma. Tim voiced his opinion in a forceful, logical manner. But notice in this third example, no comma. We discussed her unique leadership qualities. And the reason we don't use a comma, twofold. The trick is, could I use and here? We discussed her unique and leadership qualities? That's not what you're saying. What you're saying is you're talking about her qualities, the unique leadership qualities. These two are working together to modify this noun qualities. They're not working separately. You couldn't use an and to connect them. Therefore, you don't use a comma. One of my favorite rules, that consecutive adjectives rule. Let's move on. Give self-assessment G a try. See if you can figure out some of those consecutive adjectives. Let's talk about repeated expressions, direct address, and omissions. Again, this is kind of like, the words in a series. Never, never, never stop learning. So we need commas. Don't ever, ever feel bad about asking a question. You need commas because you're wanting to show some pause. And this third one, this is directed at my husband. There's a couple of things wrong with this sentence, actually. I'm sorry. There's one thing wrong. The commas are used correctly. I'm asking you, comma, Rick, as if I'm pointing to him. Direct address. And this is different from my son John, who's attending Palomar, because I'm pointing to Rick. I'm asking you, Rick, to stop asking me where your socks are at. And hopefully, ooh, that at hurts. I don't like that. It should be just where your socks are. But the point I'm wanting to make here is that in direct address, when I'm addressing Rick directly, I would use my commas. And then this third one's an interesting one. Starting today, introductory element, comma, Martha will be in charge of sales, semicolon. Eric, comma, marketing, semicolon. Edward, comma, manufacturing. Note two things here. One, how our comma is indicating an omission. It's indicating Eric will be in charge of, or the will be in charge of. It says Eric, comma, marketing. Edwin, I don't need the will be in charge of. It's inferred. But the comma is indicating that omission, and I really like this. And you note, of course, how I use semicolons to separate that list of stuff. And the reason is because of all, or the reason is that all of the commas are there. Why don't you give Self-Assessment H a try and see if you can practice with some of those. And that concludes our lecture on commas, part 2. Thank you.